because we do
Your
record these and put
conference is
them.
being recorded.
We do record these and put them out on our website. The first 25 minutes, I will go through the slides. And again, as I mentioned, if you're comfortable being recorded and having your questions out for public consumption, feel free to pop in and ask any questions that you need. Otherwise, I will also stop the recording at 25 after to leave a full 5 minutes for a discussion or questions where we're not being recorded, so we can kind of dive in and dig into things. So if you do have anything, you have time to wait then, or feel free to chime in as we move along. So today's subject is either something that you love to do or you sometimes dread doing. And for those of you who have been through the full 2-day training, you know that we do spend a fair amount of time going over how to prepare for a readback, how to deliver a readback, and tips on that during training. But I feel as though no matter how many of these you've done, it's always good to continue to practice. This is one of those that practice, practice, practice. Even I, at this point, when I come in and do a big block of them, it's just good to kind of get your preparation and refresh yourself on how to do these. So we're going to go over today a few different aspects of the readback process. We're going to talk about where the different places are in the cycle that you might conduct a readback. We're going to look at some of the tools in the system that are embedded in the system to use in your preparation, why those things are important for preparation when doing a readback. We're also going to look at some of the other tools either in the system or if you've gone through training, some of the toolkit or the flashcards that can help you get the most out of preparation for this. We're also going to go over today, for those of you who have been around a while, we've talked about reference patterns. And PI is changing the reference patterns just a little bit. They've added 2 new ones, and they've slightly changed the names of them. So we're going to look at actually the new names that will be coming out with the new system and where to find information on how to use the reference pattern in getting you information and insights for readbacks. And then we'll look at where to find all of this and what comes next. So we'll jump right in here with the where, whens, whys, hows of readbacks. And it's a weird word, right? So it's kind of our own word, readback. All the readback means, if you're not familiar with it, is feedback to someone who's taken the behavioral assessment. And why we do this is there's other behavioral assessment tools out there that are sort of a plug and play, if you will, where you can simply print out a full report. Some of them are up to 50-page reports that gives a lot of in-depth information about the person who took it. PI works a little bit differently. We really believe that people being as individual as they are, that this information is living and breathing as well. So that while we do have reports that you can use, those are to be accompanied by actual human feedback, by trained people who have learned how to read these charts, to interpret the data and the information, and to be able to give that information back. What's helpful about that and why we do that is for some people, this may be their very first introduction to a self-awareness tool. And sometimes reading a report, it might not have as much information in there or be delivered in a way that person will be able to digest it or hear it as best. So we really want to check in with people to be able to get the most out of these tools, especially past hiring in the coaching and the managing and the inspiration portion. Having that human element will help us get their buy-in for the tool and get the most out of the tool. When do we do this, right? So that's a question that we get asked a lot is, when is it best, when should we be doing these readbacks? Number one, I don't think that it could be just a one and done kind of thing. I think when a new employee starts, having a readback be a part of the onboarding process is something that we highly recommend. And whether that's, we've got a lot of videos that you guys can use in your onboarding process. That's going to be a whole nother webinar in 2018 on how to onboard. But there's lots of different tools to introduce people to PI that you can, on their first day, give them a 7-minute video to introduce it to them, or within their first week. We recommend within the first 2 weeks of someone starting that someone, whether it's their manager or someone from HR or someone else who's been trained, sit down with them and do a readback on their predictive index behavioral pattern, behavioral assessment. Another additive to this that we like to recommend is that you actually, especially for new employees, read their manager back with them. So that way, they can get a lot of information really quickly that it might take them months to learn, right? So how does my manager work? How do I work, and how do I and my manager work together? That's some really valuable information to get someone started and feeling comfortable. So again, just general recommendation is within that first 2-week period. Then this can also be used throughout the employee life cycle. So when you're giving feedback, at year end, during reviews, you can bring their PI back out and maybe go a little bit deeper now that you know them, rather than that first initial readback. We're going to be focusing today just on that first initial one, but this can be used throughout the employee's life cycle to continue to go deeper into what their preferences are. And when we look at the self-concept, also look at how they're adapting or how they think they need to adapt. This is a good time to weave those two together. Who does it? It's, again, either their manager, someone in HR, or whoever's been trained to do this. And that's really kind of dependent on how your company is structured and how large and how many resources you have. I don't know if you guys know this. This is something that we do offer, not as part of your package, but if you're looking to do kind of a large section of readbacks, we do this a lot for companies where they hire us to come in and do these for them. If that's something that you do want to talk about, catch me afterwards, shoot me or your consultant an email. We can talk to you guys more about that. All right. So preparing for readbacks. From my perspective, the prep is what's going to make it feel more comfortable for you. So if you know what you're talking about, it's going to come out nice and easy. These are just some high-level suggestions that we give when you're preparing for a readback. So what we look at are the primary factors, the 4 factors, right, and what the associated needs and behaviors are. So those primary factors, again, are dominance, extroversion, patience, and formality, the A, B, C, and D. I actually like to start with the widest factor combinations. That's going to give you the most information. So the first widest is going to give you the most information about a person, right? We tend to look at the top 3. There are 6 in total. And especially if you're newer at this, I suggest going through and looking at all 6 and then deciding which of those is going to give you the most information about this person. And we're not only looking at what those combinations are, but what the intensity of them are, that spread, right? How far away those 2 factors are from each other. Then the third thing we look at are anything else to note. So if any of you remember from training that cut back D, right? So that D is coming back in towards the midline. For someone who tends to be less of a rule follower, it's like, oh, right, there's some rules I need to follow. The AD conflict, just as a quick reminder of that, that's when the A and the D are stacked right on top of each other, and that's 1 foot on the gas, 1 foot on the brake when it comes to risk and decision making. So that's something you would definitely want to note. If there are any situational factors, so factors right close to the midline. Another thing here that I forgot to put in, something to note is if one factor is on the high side and all of the other factors are on the low side, that's going to give you a lot of information too. So just anything to note, anything that's either, not unusual, but noteworthy about the pattern. those are the three main things, because most of the readback you're going to focus on that self pattern. So we're only looking at the self pattern, that top graph, when we're referring to those three. What we would want to look at from the self to the self concept is what modifications they're making, what changes they're making. And I have an example that we're going to look at today. In your first touch point, you may want to keep that really high level and just kind of explain to them. This is one where during the coaching or managing stage and using this for a readback, that can come in really handy to really dig into what someone thinks they need to be doing to perform well in their position. And then just looking at their M and their E, the M score and the E factor. So some of you may have been trained years ago where the M factor meant something. Morale was usually what they would call it with. The PI has done a lot of have done a lot of study behind that in the recent years, and have found that that actually has no indication for morale whatsoever. So we really only use that M score now to gauge whether the pattern is valid. So as long as it's in that certain range, right? Right now it's about between 6 and 80 on the individuals. So if they've answered between 6 and 80, they're good. If they're lower than that, we want to look at it. If they're higher than that, we'd want to look at it. So that's just the high level of what we're going to look at when we're preparing for the readbacks. But don't worry, you don't have to remember all this or do it on your own. They've built a lot of really great things into the system. So here you see that on this section here, the top right, reports and guides, that actually will show up when you search for a person. So when you type in, Sue Brown, there it is, and you'll be able to click right on that thing that I've highlighted, the Readback Prep Guide. That'll actually bring you into Catalyst and bring up a guide that will prep you for your readback. So really handy thing right there with you. And just as a side note, anything with that lightning bolt next to it in the system, that means it's a static thing that's referenceable, and it will bring you to a new site into Catalyst. You can also just go straight into Catalyst and up in the search bar, type in Readback or Readbacks. The top one that's going to come up there you see is Prepare for a Readback. That's the exact same thing as that Readback Prep Guide, and we're going to look at sections of that today. There's also, other resources in Catalyst, the Readback video series. So if you're wanting a little bit more information on, how do I do this? There's actually a series of videos in Catalyst that are done by people at PI so that you can watch someone giving a readback. So you can continue to kind of model that after somebody. There's these onboarding sessions that are actually live sessions that you can sign up for and join. But those top two right there, the Prepare for the Readback and the Readback video series, are the two that I highly recommend going in and checking out the next time you're in Catalyst. All right. So here is that prep guide that I mentioned. This graph in the middle here is actually right on that. Downloads as a PDF, and you can print them out right on them, or you should be able to modify them if you have a PDF modifier. So as I mentioned, we'd look at the 4 drives. So we're looking at the 4 factors individually. You're going to note whether they're high or low. I also recommend in there noting the intensity. So noting if it's a 3 sigma high A. That's going to be a whole lot different than, 2/5 of a sigma high A, right? And you can write in the needs and the behaviors, and we'll go through different places. If you don't remember those right off the top of your head, you are not alone. We'll go through a couple different places where you can find those. So with this section, you'd go through all 4, write down, whether it's high or low, what the intensities are, what the needs are, and what the behaviors are. And again, you likely either know this person or have an indication, and keep it nice and high level at this point. The second section which again, as I've mentioned, is what I think is the most important. And that's just personal opinion here, but I really do think this gives you the best information are those factor combinations. So there's a section here for you to go through and identify each of the 6 factor combinations, what their spread is. And again, you don't have to get too technical with that. You can just write whether it's widespread or more narrow, or just count the blocks. So you can just, how many blocks away are they? So 3 blocks, 4 blocks, 6 blocks. And I have an example that I'll show you kind of what I mean about that if that's not clear to you yet. And then in the description next to it, you would write in, again, some needs and behaviors that are connected to this combination. My recommendation is to start with the widest in that top box and move to the most narrow. It's likely that you'll only use the data, especially for a first readback, out of the first 2 to 3, but it's good to have that there just as extra information if the person wants you to keep going and digging in. And then also on this prep form, there's a couple little things to note. So self-concept, just noting any of the changes from the self and what that might mean. So for those of you that have gone through training, you'll remember that we have easy, moderate, or hard changes. The easy changes are anything that's kind of on the same side. So if you had someone that did have, that 3 sigma high A that pulled it back into that first sigma, it's an easy change. Same factor, same side, just lessening the intensity. A moderate would be if it crossed over the midpoint, right? So if you've got someone that's, approaching into that second sigma for dominance, and they've dropped it back into the, the first sigma on the low side. That would definitely, that's a more moderate or more, it's starting to get hard, taking a little bit more energy to make that modification. So anytime it crosses the midpoint, that's where it gets into moderate. And then finally, hard, if you remember, is only when the AD relationship changes. So as a refresher, that AD relationship is all about risk and decision-making, so risk tolerance and decision-making. If that relationship has changed, that's usually an indicator of someone that's making a pretty significant modification, and that would be something to note, definitely. And then finally, on the synthesis, that's where we look at the whole M-score as well as that E factor. So if there's something interesting about the E, or just simply explaining, excuse me, that the E is the indicator of whether you tend to lean towards objective or subjective data when making a decision. If it's inside their pattern, as a reminder, they can go either way. If it's outside, they're more exclusively one way or the other. And that M factor, you can simply explain to them, this is how many words you chose. So there are 86 possible adjectives, and you chose 30 of them. On the self, 20 on the self-concept, for a total of 50 down here. Just people like that information depending on how they're made up, right? All right. So here we are. So this is my sample person here. So as you're going through, and also you want to make the readback process your own. So whatever your intro is, decide whether you're going to show the graph to them. I tend to kind of stay away from really focusing and pointing to the graph, because they're going to want to know, especially depending on how they're built, they either don't want that much detail or they're going to want more detail. And there's not usually that sweet spot. So referring to it but not using it as your anchor is a really good idea. If you are going to lead with the graph, make sure that you explain each segment. So explain what the self-concept, the synthesis represent. Explain kind of how to read it. So starting at the midpoint, moving out. Like, those are good things if you're going to using the graph as a grounding. One thing that I cannot stress enough is avoid referring or pointing to the letters. A, B, C, and D don't mean anything to these guys. And quite frankly, I don't even use dominance, extroversion, patience, and formality in my first touch readback. I simply begin to explain what they're telling me, not what the PI definitions are, because most of you know, those don't really coincide with what they mean always, and people can get stuck on the word, extroverted. Like, I'm really an introvert, but so just make sure that you're not kind of pointing like, see, you have a high B. That sort of gets lost in translation, and they can get stuck on it. And using the system tools. So down on the bottom, you'll see where it says factors and it lists them out. When you're in the system, you can actually click on those, and they will give you information on what each of those are. So I'm going to quick pop to another slide. So when you click on the A, you get the block on the right there. So it's going to give you the needs and behaviors for low and high. So really easy tool right here when you're doing your prep. You don't even need to have your toolkit from training. You can just use this. And the same with the factor combination. So when you clicked on that factor combination, it would bring up all 6. So if you're like, gosh, I can't remember, what is that 6th one? There's a reference. They're all right there. And you just have to figure out, whether it's A over B or B over A. And it gives you the information there to put into your prep sheet. So, and then the reference patterns also bringing up that this person is most closely aligned to a persuader. So that's going to help you to remember to say, oh, you tend to be really persuasive. So in this example here, the widest spread is that B-C relationship, right? So B over C, you definitely want to go with that and that AD conflict. And if those are the only 2 things you talked about, that would give that person plenty of information about themselves. Okay. So from a couple tips for readbacks, I mentioned a few of these already. Make it conversational. You're just talking to a person about themselves, and most of us really like to hear about ourselves. One of the things with this, too, is, reassure everybody that there's no right or wrong answers or bad patterns. A lot of people come in and they're like, oh, am I crazy, or am I going to, am I wrong for my job? That kind of stuff. Avoid, again, using the A, B, C, or D or PI terms that they're not going to understand. If you don't have the time to explain what each of the factors mean, just don't even bring the words up. Not a big deal. They are no worse for the wear not knowing that A it stands for dominance. Just like any kind of feedback, describe the positive behaviors early in the conversation. The one thing about this that I want to make note of, though, is that if you're someone who is low dominance, let's say, it might be hard for you to say that someone is, giving the feedback to them. Like, you can be really assertive and sometimes, really push to get what it is that you want. For you, that might not sound like a positive behavior. I want you guys to remember that the person hearing it is going to hear it as positive because that's them and they like that. They'll tend to like the things about themselves. So remember to come from their perspective, not from yours, or from their pattern, not your pattern. That's one of the trickier ones to get in. And it's no big deal if you don't, but don't couch it by putting your opinion. You're like, but that's okay. We all have to do that, or just giving them the information about themselves, it usually will land really well for them. And remember that we're describing a person, not the pattern. So this comes into saying you have an I, instead of saying you have a high A, we'd come back to saying you're really confident, you take charge, you'll pick up the ball and move forward with things, right? So describing the person and their behaviors, not just the pattern. And one of the big things is allow them time to process what you're telling them. Stop talking. You don't have to fill the whole space with you talking. Give them a couple pieces of information, take a break, and say, do you have any questions? How does that resonate for you? Does this sound right? That's the number one thing. And when in doubt, just take a break. Just take a breath and let them hear it. All right. So the reference tools, as I mentioned, your toolkit from training. I showed you some of those PI website shortcuts. If you still have your flashcards from training, those are a great tool. the Catalyst video series that I mentioned, the reference patterns, and you guys always, 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 you can call us here. Call me, call your consultant, or just call our office number and say, hey, do you have a few minutes? I have to do a readback, and I'd love to just kind of go over it with you. We will happily help you guys prep or give you insights on things. That's why we're here. We, you know, you get us along with the website. Couple quick things I want to point out are, so reference patterns, as I mentioned, the names are changing. If any of you haven't gone into the beta yet, pop into the beta and just start to look around. They're adding more and more things all the time. It's really a look and feel beta right now so that you guys can get used to what might be out there. One thing that they've added that I think is really great is they've put the reference pattern name in so you guys don't have to figure it out anymore. So if you look at that second one down there, that's actually the example I gave you before, and that's a persuader. So that way you then know which one it is to go look up information on. The new names are out on actually PI's website, so if you're interested in those, you can just go to predictiveindex.com and it'll have all the profiles out there. These are the analytic group. The names have changed slightly, but we haven't added any. Social profiles, we added the Maverick, so that's sort of a straight line, high A, low D, super risk taker, big picture thinker. You guys, I'm sure, are seeing a lot more of those come across your desks. We've also added in the stabilizing profiles an adapter. If you notice, it looks like a little chameleon. That's that within 2/5 of a sigma high or low. That's our chameleon pattern. So that's a new pattern as well. And then finally, our persistence down here. One of the places that you can go is out into Catalyst. Again, you can search reference patterns, and that will actually give you a breakdown. It's the old names, not the new names, so you'll be missing those two, but everything else is in there, and it gives you a great big breakdown on each of the reference patterns, so that's a good tool to use as well. So I'm going to stop recording now. Actually, quick through this. Next live lunch and learn January 25th. We have a 2-day becoming on the 20th and 21st, so if you or any of your team need to get trained, that's going to be with me in Westwood at PI's headquarters. We have our recorded webinars. You guys always know, reach out to us anytime you need. And these are some things that we looked at. The new reference profiles will be coming soon to Catalyst, but check out the video series, the Readback video series, and the Prepare to Conduct a Readback.